total package, you know.
Molly Watson has found a good catch, too.
She finally found her Prince Charming.
I was numb. I was in shock. That's my husband.
The date has been saved and the invitation sent.
I knew something not right about this guy.
He's the ultimate con man. What's important to him is having power and having control.
Until the groom gets cold feet.
He said she was driving him crazy.
He knew the walls were closing in. He had to do something.
I woke up and I smelled gas.
1011, what's your emergency? There's a woman laying on the ground in front of a car.
She's been shot execution style.
I think I was supposed to die. I grew up in Paris, Missouri. It's just a really small town, lots of farms. Everybody kind of knows everybody. It's just a very small, rural community.
In the summer of 1994, 22-year-old Melanie Shepard is leading a hectic life, leaving her little time for romance.
I was going to school at College of the Ozarks. I was studying education. I wanted to be an English teacher. I was just really busy going to school and working. I was a cashier at a convenience store. I really didn't date that much.
Everything changes when a 28-year-old mechanic walks into the store one night. His name is James Addy.
There was a long line of people, and he was trying to check out, and he kind of yelled up to the front of the line, "Will you hurry up?" And I just kind of gave it right back to him. I said, "I'm doing the best I can." And he said, "Well, I'm cooking barbecue at my house." And I said, "I don't get any, I don't care." So later that night, he brought me some barbecue. And that's kind of how we met. I thought it was very sweet that he would go out of his way to do that for me. It was very nice. On a busy night, it was a nice surprise.
James returns to the store a week later, and this time, he's not buying groceries.
He asked me to come over, and that was our first date. He cooked supper for me. The food was good, and he's feeding me a lot. So that was kind of fun. We got to know each other pretty well, pretty fast. We both really liked each other. He just seemed like the kind of person that could take care of me and take care of himself and take care of a family. He seemed like husband material. Just a total package, you know?
Not long after they start dating, James drops a bombshell.
He shares with her that he's been married 3 times. So that's kind of shocking for Melanie. 3 times by 28, that's a lot.
He said they were cheaters. They were unfaithful and not good people. They were just gold diggers and trying to take advantage of him and of his good nature and his goodwill.
Despite this awkward beginning, 6 months into the relationship, things are getting serious, and James pops the question.
They were sitting on the couch talking, and he just sort of blurted out, "Will you marry me?"
I said, yes, of course. At that age, you want fairy tales and romance and happy endings. It was fun going to pick out a ring and being engaged. Felt like a grown-up. I felt very confident that I was with a good person. I was with the right person, and he wanted the same things that I did.
In the spring of 1995, James and Melanie get married. The newlyweds seem destined for a happy family life and soon welcome 2 kids.
Just had our perfect little family, 1 boy and 1 girl. I am a nurturing person, and I want to take care of my kids, and I want to take care of my husband, and I want to take care of my house. I think he saw that yeah, that would work. That would work for him. That would work as a wife and good partner in life. I think that's what he wanted. He was a strong person. He was the protector and very capable of handling life. He was definitely the leader of the family. He took care of business.
In 2004, James takes on a higher-paying job as a prison guard, 30 miles away at the Moberly Correctional Center.
He really liked his job. He really did well in his job. He had no problem telling people what to do or being that aggressive person if he had to be. He could keep people in line. I think it was a real ego boost for him to have people listen to him and jump when he said jump. And then he expected it to happen at home, too. He wanted to have someone just follow along with whatever he said. It was tough because I'm not a prisoner. He didn't like that I had my own opinions, and he would get upset.
After 8 years of marriage and with her children now in school, Melanie looks to pursue her teaching career. But James puts his foot down.
He didn't want me to work. He didn't want me to go back to school. He kept saying, oh no, you need to stay at home. You need to stay at home. He just didn't want me out in the world and, come home and talk about my coworkers and talk about my job. He didn't want that. He wanted me to be focused solely on him. And he got very upset with me. He said I don't support him, and it was a big problem. It was a huge fight. That was very unexpected. I thought we were a team. I thought, we were building this life together, and I was supposed to just leave everything behind and just be his wife now. I didn't like that.
The arguments only get worse. For someone who craves control, James starts losing it.
He could get so mad that he would be threatening and intimidating and throw things. I can remember going through a lot of salt and pepper shakers. I just would always just stand there because I don't want to be intimidated. I don't like that feeling. I don't like backing down from that.
11 years into the marriage and desperate for a sense of independence, Melanie finally defies James.
I started working. I was a substitute teacher, which was perfect while the kids were in school. It felt like this is where I should be. This is what I wanted to do. And it was nice to get out. I always said I liked being a stay-at-home mom, but I liked when it ended too. I liked a new thing to do.
For James, I think it was probably very scary. She has priorities and parts of her life that don't center around him anymore. I think at this point in time, James realizes that maybe Melanie is not going to be the submissive wife that he wants.
6 years into his job at the prison, James's work has strangely become all-consuming, and he disappears for longer lengths of time.
He would leave about 5:30 in the morning. It only takes 45 minutes to get there. So he left pretty early. And then he wouldn't get home till about 5 at night. That's 2 hours after his shift ended. I would just question him, why are you always so late? And he was angry with me. He's like, why can't you leave me alone? He'd just say, well, I stopped and talked to people, or I went to get gas. Sometimes he'd have to wait on a train to go by. He had all these little excuses. So it was just odd.
There's a reason James is spending longer hours away from home, and it has nothing to do with work. He's spending more and more time with one of the other guards. Her name is Molly Watson.
Molly wanted to get a job that could make pretty good money that she could save back for her and her son, so she could go back to school. And so she started out at the Moberly prison. Her ultimate goal was to be a psychologist.
Molly needs the money as she's a single mom raising her son on her own.
Molly was a really good mom. She gave him all the love in the world.
I am very much a huge geek. I hate being called a nerd.
I wanted Molly to find somebody that respected her for her, that treated her like she deserved to be treated, you know.
In 2011, just a year into her new job, Molly has started dating someone new, and she's excited to introduce him to her brother.
When I first met him, I just kind of looked at him and I was like, hi, you know, I'm Tim. And he's just like, yeah, I'm James. And he put his head down. Just something about him, I didn't like him from the get-go. He was very standoffish. He would never look you in the eye to talk to you. He didn't really seem to care.
James's off-putting demeanor likely raised questions as to who he was, what were his intentions, and really, what was he hiding?
Just something was off about him. I knew there's something not right about this guy.
In 2011, Melanie and James Addy have been married for 16 years. Across town, Molly Watson has fallen hard for the same James Addy.
She adored him. She doted on him. She loved him unconditionally. She made James her number one priority, and that's what James was looking for. He wanted somebody who put him first, always.
Molly's family is less than impressed with this new man in her life, who's 16 years her senior.
Molly told me he was in the process of getting a divorce, you know, for 6 years, that he had like 2 kids.
He says that he's trying to be there for his kids and do what's best for them, so he's still living with his estranged wife.
I thought that was weird, you know. I've been divorced and I wouldn't live with my ex-wife.
James visits Molly almost every day after work at her parents' house. They spend all their time together in her bedroom.
Molly is living at home with her parents. She's very close with her family. He's not making any attempts to really build a relationship with them. And so it just seems like there's secrets and there's something that's just not right.
He would try to keep her away from everybody. James would try to separate Molly from her son. You could always tell that he did not want Molly's son in their life at all. My dad didn't like him. My mom flat out told me, you know, I don't like the guy. And it killed me to watch my sister keep dating him because, you know, I knew she could do better.
Molly is so enamored with James, she brushes her family's concerns aside.
She was in love. I mean, love is blind, and in her case, that's the truth. You could point out things to her that were obvious and just, she would deny it.
In 2016, 5 years into their relationship, Molly and James take their first trip together.
He received a phone call from one of his friends. He got off the phone and I said, what was that about? And he said, oh, he wants me to go to Mexico with him.
Melanie encourages him to go with his coworkers and have a good time. In reality, James wasn't going with coworkers. He was going to Mexico with Molly, his secret girlfriend. For Molly, this was amazing. She wanted to go on a vacation with James so badly. She was madly in love with him, and this was just an opportunity for them to grow their relationship and spend more time together.
It looked like when they started to go on vacation that they were more committed to each other. You know, like he was maybe getting serious about it. You know, we've had the doubts about him, but okay. maybe this is good.
When James returns home a week later, Melanie notices something odd about his photos.
I said, well, where are the other people that you went with? And he said, oh, I don't want pictures of them. So there was only pictures of him and the resort and the beach. And that's all I saw.
A year later, unbeknownst to Melanie, James takes her to the same vacation spot where he took Molly.
It was so nice. We just had each other and we spent all our time together, and it was a great trip. We had so much fun.
At this point, James has been carrying on this double life for so long that he's gotten so used to it and comfortable, to the point where he's arrogant enough to take his wife on the same vacation he took his mistress.
In October 2017, when James lies and tells Molly his divorce is finalized, she's ready to take the next step.
The only thing she told me about the proposal was that she had asked James to marry her, and he said yes. Molly looked really happy. You could tell that she was ready to get married.
Now he's got to figure out what he's going to do because he still has a wife.
Molly quickly busies herself prepping for her dream wedding. She picks April 29th, 2018 as the date, and she's planning to hold it at the Stony Creek Hotel, where Samantha Cohen is their wedding planner.
She had a smile on her face the entire time we would meet. She just had, this look in her eye of like, this is my day, I'm so excited, let's make this happen. She wanted to be the princess for the day. Every girl imagines their wedding day and wanting to be the bride or the princess walking down the aisle.
That's what she wanted, find Prince Charming, settle down happily ever after. But I thought, what's she thinking, she don't want to marry this guy. Nothing good can come of it.
During the Christmas holidays, just a few months before the wedding is to take place, James shares some devastating news with Molly.
He tells Molly that his ex-wife Melanie has been in a terrible car accident. She's actually on life support. And he needs to be there for his children and to help them with the care of their mother.
Molly felt bad for James, told him, if he needed her to back off any, and give him some space, she would, and that she was there for him, whatever he needed, that she understood he was doing it for his kids. I think it made Molly feel guilty about the wedding coming up.
Is Melanie's supposed accident a strategy for James to get out of the wedding? Melanie, in fact, is alive and well, for now. But soon, she will come perilously close to death.
There's this really strong gas smell in our bedroom.
I believe that Melanie was at a very high risk of being killed.
To think that you're so close to losing your life, it's terrifying. It was late at night, midnight, 1 o'clock. I woke up and I smelled gas. It was very, very strong in the bedroom. I thought, well, this is not dissipating, this is not normal. And Jim wasn't there. He wasn't in our bed, he wasn't in the bathroom. So I got up and I went to find Jim to tell him that there's this really strong gas smell.
She goes downstairs and she finds that all the windows and doors are closed.
Jim wasn't anywhere in the house. And I thought, this could be serious. This particular night, he was outside on the deck, smoking a cigarette. It was unusual for him to be outside smoking. He would usually just smoke in the dining room at the window. So I told him, I said, really strong gas smell, I don't know what it is. He said, okay, well, you stay out here. And he went back in the bedroom and opened the windows and just said, I don't know, it's probably some farm equipment outside.
But it's a little suspicious because the windows are closed, and when she goes outside, she doesn't have this overpowering odor anymore.
Eventually, the smell did go away, and I was able to go back to bed, so I don't have an explanation for that. It was so strange.
While Melanie worries about James and his odd behavior, Molly Watson is blissfully anticipating her fairy tale wedding. After 7 years of dating James, her dream is finally coming true.
Her excitement was so palpable. I mean, you watch her videos and she just radiates excitement and love.
Hi everyone, it's Molly, and here is the dress on me, and I have to say I was actually really impressed.
You can tell just by talking to her, she has always dreamt of her wedding. I mean, she had 3 wedding dresses. Like, this was not just any normal day in her life. She's been dreaming of how this wedding was gonna look for years. I think she finally found, her Prince Charming, and this was the next chapter of her life.
Molly seems unaware that James lacks the same enthusiasm, but his detached demeanor is obvious to others.
When I was meeting with James and Molly, it was all Molly giving the input. He really just sat there kind of staring off into space. He was a very quiet man, didn't smile often, and just kind of was there. He didn't really give much input into the conversations, and he just didn't seem like he really wanted to be there. He didn't seem to care.
He said, oh, well, we're getting married, as long as it shuts her up, whatever. That's kind of his attitude towards it.
On April 22nd, just a week before the wedding, James drops another bombshell about his supposed ex-wife.
We were told she was in this coma, and they determined that she would never recover from her injuries. From what Molly told me directly, Melanie's life support, they were going to go ahead and pull the plug because they decided that she was too brain damaged and that they were going to have to just let her go.
I, reached out to Molly to get a final in-person meeting scheduled with her and James, and she had emailed me back saying, I don't know if James will be able to make the meeting as his ex-wife had just passed away that weekend before.
James is lying, and Melanie is still very much alive, unbeknownst to Molly and everyone else around her.
I think James wanted so badly to get out of this predicament he had created that he was hoping by creating this tragic situation and backstory that maybe Molly would come to the conclusion to cancel the wedding, and that would sort of be his get out of jail free card. But that's not what happened. He needed to keep up the charade as the loving fiance, and so he doesn't cancel the wedding because he knows that's going to devastate her.
2 days before the wedding, James still hasn't told Molly the truth.
That Friday when he came in by himself after dropped everything off and paid, I asked him, how are you feeling? And the only words that he said was that she was driving him crazy.
It's probably pretty common for grooms to be a little annoyed with brides as it gets close to the wedding. But for James, I think Molly was driving him crazy because he knew the walls were closing in. He was still married to Melanie, and he had to figure something out quickly.
The night of April 27th, Molly abruptly leaves her parents' home without much of an explanation.
She was actually making something to eat when suddenly she got a phone call. And after that phone call, Molly leaves really quickly. And she just sort of rushed out of the house. Given that she was cooking, her parents felt like she would be back really quickly.
At his home, James tells his wife Melanie he's stepping out.
He was out in the garage, and then he came in and said he was going to go to a friend's house. This was about 7 o'clock, and then I went to bed about 7:30. I usually go to bed pretty early.
Later that night, a driver on a deserted road notices something unusual.
He sees these two vehicles parked on the side of the road. He figures one of them is having engine trouble, so he stops to see if he can help. An older man tells him that everything's fine, he can go. And so he proceeds on his way. On his way back, he passes the same spot, only this time there's only one vehicle.
The Monroe County Sheriff's Office got a call around 10:30 at night that a passerby named Glenn McSparron had found a woman in a very remote area of Monroe County on a low water crossing. He told police that there was a woman who was laying in front of a car on this dusty, dirty country road. Her eyes were open. She did not appear alive to him.
Investigators rush to the scene.
Police quickly identify the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head. This woman is out in the middle of nowhere, and she's been shot execution style. It leads them to believe this was a planned murder, and someone lured her out there. And they identify her by finding a marriage license on her passenger seat that identifies her as Molly Watson, who's engaged to be married to James Addy.
In the early hours of April 28th, just one day before Tim Watson's sister is to be married, he gets a call from his dad.
As soon as I saw what time it was, I knew it was something serious. He said, "Timmy, the highway patrol just left our house. They found Molly dead on this dirt road." And immediately I was in shock.
About 2:30 in the morning, I got up and I looked out the window, and there were 4 vehicles with flashing lights. I went to the door, and Jim was there first. He opened the door for these 4 cops. So I asked them, "What's going on? Why are you here?" And nobody would answer me. Finally, somebody asked me, he said, "Who are you?" And I pointed to Jim and said, "Well, I'm his wife." And Jim said, "Yes, that's my wife." And then the mood kind of changed a little bit.
Investigators had no idea what they were walking into. They thought they were making a death notification to a fiancé, and they find out he's already married for 23 years. They discovered Melanie Addy, and everything changed. Suddenly, James Addy, who they expected to be the bereaved fiancé who would surely receive the worst news of his entire life, was now a suspect.
Detectives escort James into the dining room for an interview, while another investigator asks Melanie curious questions.
Where were you tonight? What did you do tonight? Do you know Molly Watson? She's been found dead. I didn't know who that was. I didn't know who Molly was. I didn't know how she was at all related to my family. They told me who Molly was and that they were going to get married. I asked him, do you have the right person? Are you sure you have the right person? Because that's my husband. I was numb. I was in shock. It was hard to get this through my head because this was my husband and this was our life, and this other person had no place in it, and the story did not make sense.
Out of Melanie's earshot, James comes clean to the officers about his relationship with Molly.
He admitted the affair and said that it had been going on for 7 years.
He tells them, though, that he had absolutely nothing to do with Molly's death.
They asked him where he was that evening. James Addy responded that he left the home around 7 o'clock to go visit a friend. He said the friend was not home, so he turned around and came back home and arrived around 8:30 that evening, and that he went to bed shortly thereafter.
Did James go to bed as he claims to police, or did he secretly meet Molly? When forensics examined the bride-to-be's computer, they find evidence to suggest she had been obsessed by one thing in the 24 hours leading up to her death. And it wasn't her wedding.
Molly Watson had been searching for evidence of Melanie Addy's death. She was searching to see if there was an obituary or any evidence of this horrible accident that had eventually led to Melanie's death. Of course, Melanie Addy was very much alive, and she was unable to find any evidence that she had passed away.
Did Molly come to the crushing realization that Melanie was alive and there would be no wedding?
I think she questioned James on it, and at that point, he knew the jig was up and he had to do something.
Back at the murder scene, investigators scour the area and find Molly's cell phone and a discarded t-shirt. Police also go through Molly's phone records and are able to piece together her last known movements.
The last phone call she ever made was 22 minutes long. 22 minutes, which is the exact amount of time it took Molly Watson to drive from her home to her death. The entire time she was on the phone with James Addy.
I think somehow he convinced her to meet up with him so they could talk about it, and he got her out in the middle of nowhere and took her life.
Police looked at the victimology of Molly Watson. Who did she know? Who in her life might want her dead? And they determined that only one person, James Addy, had the motive, means, and opportunity to take Molly's life.
James Addy is arrested and taken into custody. The next day, Melanie starts looking for evidence of James's double life.
I went out to the garage, which was kind of his domain. It was a lot of storage things that we kept up there, a lot of boxes. And I started looking a little closer at the boxes, and these were not my things. These were Molly's things. They had her name on the boxes. And that's when I found the photo album of them on vacation. And a lot of kitchen stuff, just household things that were at my house. She was planning on moving in, I guess. It was very overwhelming. I didn't know how to process this. He was home every night. I don't know when he saw her or how they formed a relationship over 7 years and why he would go forward with marrying her or planning this wedding when he was still married to me. How is this supposed to work? I don't know what he was thinking. I was just angry, just angry.
Melanie thinks back to the night of the gas leak and is left to wonder about James's possible intentions. The thought is chilling.
I started to put all of that together about the gas in the bedroom. I think the idea was for me not to wake up. I think I was supposed to die. I think he was trying to get rid of one of us.
Had James tried to kill Melanie but failed, so he chose Molly instead? James Addy has been arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Molly Watson. A heartbroken Melanie confronts her husband.
I went to the jail a few days after he was arrested and asked him, what the hell? What are you doing? This is our life. And he didn't have any answers. He apologized for the affair. He never admitted that he killed her. He said that he was sorry and he didn't know we had such a perfect life. Too late now. He lost everything, and he knew it. He knew everything was gone. He knew I wasn't going to stick around. I was not going to be his support system anymore. This was it. We were done.
James's case goes before the court in the spring of 2021. Prosecutors paint a picture for the jury of what they believe happened that fateful night.
The night of April 27th, I believe that he called Molly Watson and told her to get in her car and start driving to this remote area. She arrived at the low water crossing, opened the door, and he shot her once, and he panicked. He left Molly's body there for anyone to find. Going into the trial, we felt that the evidence against James Addy was overwhelming.
The T-shirt found by police is a key piece of evidence.
In addition to the T-shirt having gunshot residue on it and the victim's blood on it, there was something else important about the T-shirt. That T-shirt had been made by James Addy's daughter, Emma Addy.
And this was specific to Emma. She had made this shirt and kind of messed up the design a little bit.
She was able to identify that T-shirt as one that she had made and given to her father. So the T-shirt was extremely important because we know it came from the crime scene because it had Molly's blood on it. And we know that it came from the defendant's home.
James had told police that on the night of the murder, he'd gone out but was home by 8:30 p.m. His daughter, though, contradicts that story when faced with the daunting task of testifying against her own father.
Emma Addy was interviewed about her father's whereabouts, and she gave a very different story.
I was still up doing homework at around 10 p.m., and that's around the time that Dad came home.
He returns home and sees his daughter Emma still up. He's a little surprised, and Emma described him as being nervous. James gets in the shower right away. And Emma also notices that her dad does laundry, something that would normally be her mom's job.
And did you smell anything? Yes, I smelled bleach.
Emma Addy's testimony was key to dispute the alibi that James Addy had provided to the police. And to be able to come into court and to tell the world that your father lied to the police, it was incredible.
She had a tough job and she handled it. She did really, really well. She's an inspiration to me. She is. She's amazing.
I just ask, plead with the jury to give this monster the max sentence possible.
On April 28th, 2021, what would have been Molly and James' third anniversary had they been married, James Addy is found guilty of Molly's murder.
I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
I just wanted justice for Molly. That's all I cared about. You know, as long as I heard those words guilty come out of the judge's mouth, and thank God they did.
He had the means, he had the motive. He didn't have a good alibi. He wasn't home that night. So it all kind of added up. He's absolutely responsible for this.
James Addy is convicted, but it's still hard to comprehend his sickening actions.
It's unfathomable that James thought the solution to the problem was to kill someone instead of just breaking up with them. In his mind, that was the right thing to do, and that's what's scary. It's terrifying that that is his way out.
Addy had walked away, just never talked to her again. we'd be fine with that. You know, she'd be upset. She'd still be here. He chose to take her life. He's an evil person.
It's tragic to think that somebody who was so excited to be a bride and to have a happily ever after instead had this tragic ending.
The family, they're the ones that suffer in this. They are the true victims. They've lost Molly, and they will lose her, you know, at family get-togethers and holidays and vacations, and she's just not there for them.
She definitely knows how much I love her. I would like Molly to be remembered as the sweet, loving, giving person she was. She'd do anything for anybody.
I'd hug her and just say how sorry I am that this happened to her. And I hope she feels that justice has been served. And I hope she's okay.
I still go out to her gravesite and I have conversations with her, you know, and she said everything's fine, everything's okay.
As for Melanie, she has found a semblance of peace in her life.
It's good that it's finally over. I'm divorced and on my own, but I'm much happier on my own than I was married. I'm good all by myself, I really am. I'm just really lucky that I have a good job, a fun job, great coworkers. I have a good life. I'm happy.
Molly Watson's life was, on the surface, built from the kind of quiet resilience that often goes unnoticed in small-town America, the kind of life that doesn't announce itself with drama or spectacle, but instead unfolds through early mornings, long shifts, and the constant balancing act of responsibility and hope. And she was someone who learned early how to carry weight without complaint, a young mother raising her son, while still trying to imagine a future that stretched beyond survival, beyond bills and schedules and the endless rhythm of daily obligations. Because beneath her practical routines there was always a deeper aspiration, something she rarely spoke about but quietly worked toward, a desire to become a psychologist, to understand people not just as they appeared on the surface, but as they were underneath, shaped by pain, memory, and choices that often remained invisible to the outside world. And this sensitivity to human complexity made her both strong and vulnerable. At the same time, because she believed in the possibility of change, in the idea that people could be understood deeply enough to be helped, and sometimes that belief extended into her personal life in ways that would later define her greatest tragedy. She was known by those closest to her as warm, attentive, and intensely devoted, especially as a mother, someone who poured herself into her child with a kind of wholeheartedness that left little room for hesitation. And in her family home, she was not just a daughter but a central presence, someone who kept emotional balance, someone others turned to when something felt uncertain. And yet despite this stability in her family identity, there was also a quiet longing in her life, a sense that she was still waiting for something to fully begin, a chapter that would feel like arrival rather than continuation, and that longing would eventually take shape in the form of a relationship that at first seemed to offer exactly that. When Molly met James Addy, it did not happen in a moment of cinematic clarity or dramatic revelation, but through proximity and routine, through shared spaces and repeated interactions that gradually became familiar, and in the beginning there was nothing that immediately suggested danger or deception, only a man who appeared steady, slightly reserved, older, someone who carried himself with a quiet authority that can easily be mistaken for stability, and for Molly, who had been navigating life largely on her own, that sense of steadiness was compelling because it suggested something she had been missing, a partner who could share responsibility, who could provide structure, who could make the future feel less uncertain. Over time, their connection deepened in a way that felt organic to her, built through conversations that stretched beyond the superficial, through moments that felt personal and intentional. And what made James particularly influential in her emotional world was not only his presence but his attentiveness, the way he seemed to listen in a manner that made her feel seen. And for someone like Molly, who invested deeply in relationships, that feeling was powerful, almost anchoring, because it created a sense of being chosen, of being prioritized, of mattering in a way that extended beyond obligation or convenience. Yet even as she became more emotionally invested, there were elements in James's life that remained deliberately unclear, boundaries that were not fully explained, stories that shifted slightly depending on context, and a general reluctance to fully integrate her into the broader structure of his world, especially when it came to family and long-term visibility. And while these gaps were noticeable, they were often rationalized within the emotional framework of the relationship, because people rarely interpret uncertainty as deception when they are already emotionally committed. Instead, they interpret it as complexity, as circumstance, as something temporary that will eventually resolve itself once timing allows. Molly's family, however, experienced those same gaps differently because from the outside looking in, patterns become more visible than they are to someone inside the relationship, and what they saw was a man who maintained distance even when physically present, who avoided deep engagement with family settings, who seemed to exist slightly apart from the emotional center of Molly's life rather than within it, and this created unease, a sense that something essential was not being revealed. But their concerns often collided with Molly's certainty, and like many families watching a loved one in love, they found themselves on the outside of a bond that could not be easily interrupted by logic or warning. As the relationship progressed, James increasingly became the central focus of Molly's emotional energy, not because she neglected her responsibilities as a mother or daughter, but because her future began to orient itself around him, and the idea of building a shared life became the emotional horizon she moved toward, and over time this vision became more concrete, eventually taking the form of marriage planning, a wedding date, and the familiar rituals that signal transition from relationship to commitment. And with that development, her emotional investment deepened further, reinforced by the belief that she was moving towards something final and stable, something that would resolve uncertainty rather than prolong it. But what Molly did not fully see, and what those around her could only partially sense, was that her relationship with James existed in a broader structure that she did not have full access to, a structure that included a long-standing marriage and a second life that had been carefully maintained in parallel. And this reality created an imbalance that shaped every interaction, because while she was moving toward visibility and commitment, he was simultaneously managing separation and concealment, and these two trajectories were fundamentally incompatible, even if they were temporarily sustained through avoidance and compartmentalization. As time passed, small inconsistencies began to appear more frequently, not in dramatic revelations but in subtle gaps, unexplained absences, vague explanations about work or obligations, moments where plans shifted without clarity, and while none of these individually constituted proof of anything, collectively they formed a pattern that suggested a life divided across competing demands. And in relationships where emotional investment is high, such patterns often create internal tension rather than immediate rejection, because the mind tends to protect what the heart has already committed to, and so uncertainty is often absorbed rather than confronted. In Molly's case, that emotional absorption was intensified by her belief in the future she was building, a future that included marriage, stability, and the fulfillment of a long-held desire for partnership, and this belief made it difficult to fully process the implications of the inconsistencies she occasionally noticed, because accepting them would require dismantling the very foundation of the life she was preparing to enter, and that kind of psychological cost is often too high for someone already standing at the edge of a significant life transition. Meanwhile, James continued to navigate both worlds with increasing confidence, maintaining the appearance of normalcy in one while sustaining emotional investment in another, and in doing so, he created a fragile equilibrium that depended entirely on separation of information, on the ability of each life to remain unaware of the other. But such systems are inherently unstable, because they rely not on truth, but on the absence of collision, and as Molly moved closer to the moment of marriage, that collision became less avoidable with each passing day. By the time wedding plans were fully in motion, Molly was emotionally and practically committed to a future that she believed was already in progress. choosing dresses, coordinating arrangements, envisioning a life that felt imminent. And this level of engagement further intensified the stakes of the relationship, because at that point the connection was no longer just emotional but structural, embedded in planning and expectation, and any disruption would not only affect feelings but identity, future, and the sense of direction she had built over years of effort. And yet beneath this growing certainty, there remained a quiet undercurrent of distance that she could not fully interpret, a sense that James was not as emotionally present in the process as she was, that his engagement with the idea of marriage was inconsistent, sometimes participating, sometimes detached, and this inconsistency, while concerning, was still filtered through the lens of trust she had developed over years, a trust that had been built not on full transparency, but on sustained presence, and presence in emotional relationships often carries more weight than clarity, even when clarity is what is needed most. It is within this emotional landscape that Molly Watson's life takes on its most tragic dimension, because she is not simply a victim of violence in its final moment, but a person whose belief in connection, in partnership, and in the possibility of a shared future was carefully cultivated over time, and that cultivation, whether intentional or not, became the foundation upon which everything else depended, until the moment when belief and reality could no longer coexist in the same space, and the consequences of that collision would extend far beyond a single night on a rural road, reaching backward into years of emotional investment and forward into the devastating aftermath that her family would be forced to live with long after the truth was revealed. The days leading up to April 27, 2018, do not feel unusual to those around Molly Watson, at least not in a way that would immediately signal danger, because life, in its most deceptive form, rarely changes its tone before something irreversible happens. It continues to move forward with the same routines, the same conversations, the same ordinary gestures that disguise the fact that something beneath the surface has already begun to shift. And for Molly, those final days are filled with anticipation rather than fear, the kind of emotional intensity that comes from standing just before a long-awaited threshold, where every decision feels meaningful and every hour feels slightly closer to the life she has been imagining for years, a wedding that is no longer just a dream but a date on a calendar, a structure of appointments, fittings, conversations, and confirmations that anchor her attention firmly to the future she believes she is stepping into, and in that emotional focus, there is little space left for doubt, even when small inconsistencies appear, because the mind at that stage of commitment tends to prioritize continuity over disruption, especially when the cost of questioning feels heavier than the comfort of belief. James Addy, however, is operating in a very different internal reality during this same period, one defined not by anticipation but by pressure, not by excitement but by containment, because the two parallel lives he has maintained for years are now converging toward a single point in time that can no longer be delayed or separated. And what once felt manageable through distance and scheduling now begins to feel constricting, as if the walls of both worlds are slowly closing in on him simultaneously, and this psychological compression becomes visible in his behavior, not in dramatic outbursts, but in subtle changes in tone, in presence, in emotional availability, as if he is constantly calculating without ever fully arriving at an answer that resolves the situation he has created. In the household he shares with Melanie Addy, there is a growing sense of unusual absence, a pattern of leaving early and returning late that no longer feels easily explained by work alone, and while explanations are offered in fragments, they lack cohesion. They do not build into a consistent narrative. Instead, they create small gaps that are difficult to ignore over time, especially for someone who has lived within the rhythms of a long marriage and knows the difference between routine, absence, and something more irregular. And yet, even within that awareness, Melanie does not have access to the full picture. She can sense displacement but not its source. She can feel distance but not its origin, and this uncertainty exists alongside daily life, blending into meals, conversations, and routines that continue to function even as emotional clarity begins to erode. At the same time, Molly is moving deeper into wedding preparation, fully immersed in the logistics and emotional significance of the event, choosing details that reflect her vision of permanence, discussing arrangements, confirming plans, and sharing moments of excitement that reinforce her belief that everything is aligning as it should. And for her, James appears to be part of that alignment. Even if his emotional engagement sometimes feels inconsistent, even if there are moments where his enthusiasm does not match hers, because those discrepancies are still interpreted through the lens of stress, timing, and external pressure rather than deception, and so they do not yet break the emotional framework she has built around the relationship. But beneath the surface, James is increasingly making decisions that suggest urgency rather than celebration, and his movements during this period become more difficult to interpret in isolation because they exist at the intersection of two lives that are no longer easily separable, and the night of April 27th becomes the point at which those intersecting paths finally converge in a way that cannot be undone. Earlier that evening, Molly receives a phone call that changes her trajectory, though at the time it does not feel like a rupture. It feels like direction, like movement toward resolution, and shortly after that call she leaves her family home abruptly, without detailed explanation, creating a brief moment of confusion for her parents who assume she will return shortly, because nothing in her routine suggests disappearance. Nothing in her behavior suggests finality, and yet she leaves with urgency that is noticeable in hindsight, an urgency that aligns with something unseen rather than something spoken. At roughly the same time, James tells Melanie that he is stepping out, offering a familiar kind of explanation tied to social contact or routine activity, the kind of explanation that does not invite further questioning because it fits within the established patterns of his behavior, and Melanie, accustomed to his irregular hours, does not immediately challenge it, because in long-term relationships, especially those shaped by habitual absence, not every departure is interrogated, and so he leaves the house, and the night continues as it always does, quiet, uneventful, appearing ordinary from the outside. But somewhere along a rural stretch of road, the ordinary begins to fracture. A driver traveling through Monroe County later that night notices two vehicles parked near a low-water crossing, an unusual sight in an area where nighttime roads are typically empty, and he slows down, unsure whether something is wrong, unsure whether assistance is needed, and what he encounters is not clarity but deflection, an older man who appears and assures him that everything is fine, that there is no issue, that he should continue on his way, and in that moment the interaction feels strange but not yet alarming, because rural instinct often trusts reassurance, especially when nothing visible contradicts it, and so the driver continues, leaving behind a scene that does not yet reveal its true nature. When he passes the same location again later, only one vehicle remains, and the absence of the second car creates an immediate sense of discontinuity, as if the scene itself has changed shape in his brief absence, and though he does not yet know why, this inconsistency will later become one of the earliest indicators that something deliberate was unfolding in that location, something controlled rather than accidental. Shortly after 10:30 p.m., authorities receive a call that brings them to the same area, where a passerby has discovered a woman lying near a vehicle on a remote road, and from the moment responders arrive, the tone of the scene shifts from uncertainty to gravity, because what they find is not an injured person waiting for help but a body already beyond assistance, positioned in a way that suggests finality rather than struggle, and the immediate determination that she has suffered a gunshot wound to the head transforms the scene into a homicide investigation within minutes, stripping away any remaining ambiguity about intent. The location itself amplifies the sense of deliberation, because this is not a place where accidents are likely to go unnoticed or where random encounters are common. It is isolated, quiet, and deliberately removed from regular activity, and that isolation suggests planning, suggests choice, suggests a decision to separate the act from witnesses, from interruption, from immediate discovery. And investigators begin to understand that whoever brought Molly Watson here did so with purpose, not improvisation. As her identity is confirmed through documents found at the scene, including wedding-related materials that tie her directly to an impending marriage, the emotional weight of the case intensifies because she is not simply a victim of violence. She is someone standing at the edge of a significant life event, someone whose future had been actively constructed in the minds of those around her. And that contrast between anticipation and abrupt finality creates a psychological impact that extends beyond the investigation itself into the families who will soon receive the call. But even as the investigation begins to form its first outlines, there is already an invisible thread connecting the location of the body, the timing of the call, and the movements of James Addy in the hours leading up to the discovery, a thread that has not yet been fully identified but is beginning to tighten because the final phone call between Molly and James, lasting 22 minutes, becomes a critical anchor point, a temporal bridge that aligns her last known movement directly with the distance between her home and the location where she is found, and this alignment transforms the narrative from a broad suspicion of foul play into a focused inquiry into coordination, communication, and control. In the aftermath of that night, as headlights fade and crime scene tape marks the boundary between ordinary road and investigative space, what remains is not just a body or a location, but the beginning of a reconstruction, a slow and methodical attempt to understand how a woman preparing for her wedding ended up alone on a rural road in the dark, and why the last person she spoke to is also the person whose life, across 2 households and 2 identities, now sits at the center of a growing and increasingly inescapable question of responsibility. When investigators arrive at the low-water crossing in the early hours of April 28th, the night has already begun to thin into a cold, colorless dawn, the kind of light that does not yet reveal warmth but only exposes what darkness had been hiding, and in that transitional hour the scene feels even more stark, as if the land itself is holding its breath, waiting for meaning to be assigned to what has already happened. And the first officers on site immediately understand that this is not an ambiguous situation, because the position of the body, the stillness of the surroundings, and the absence of any signs of a struggle that extended beyond a single decisive moment all point toward an execution-style killing, a phrase that carries weight not just in investigative terms, but in emotional gravity, because it implies intent, proximity, and choice. And those elements transform the case from a possible roadside tragedy into something far more deliberate and personal. The victim is identified quickly through items found near her, including a marriage license and personal belongings that tie her directly to a life that had been publicly moving toward celebration, not termination. And as that identity becomes clear, the emotional landscape of the investigation shifts, because Molly Watson is not a stranger. She is someone on the verge of marriage, someone whose life is still actively in motion in the minds of her family, and the realization that she is the one lying motionless on this isolated stretch of road creates an immediate rupture between expectation and reality that investigators can see reflected in the urgency of the calls that begin to come in from family members who have not yet been told what has happened but already sense that something is wrong. The physical scene itself tells a story that is both sparse and deeply suggestive, because there are no obvious signs of a prolonged struggle, no chaotic scattering of objects that would indicate a drawn-out confrontation. Instead, there is a contained violence, a moment that appears to have unfolded quickly and decisively, and the location amplifies that sense of control. Because the low-water crossing is not a place one arrives at by accident in the middle of the night, it is remote, quiet, and deliberately out of the way, suggesting that whoever brought Molly here understood not only how to avoid detection but how to create conditions where discovery would be delayed, and that intentionality becomes one of the earliest and most important conclusions drawn by investigators. As crime scene technicians begin their work, the focus shifts from the emotional impact of the discovery to the careful reconstruction of events, and every detail becomes significant, every trace potentially meaningful, because in cases like this, where the victim is found in isolation, the physical environment must be treated as a witness, one that cannot speak directly but can still reveal patterns if examined closely enough. And so the road surface, the surrounding brush, the positioning of the vehicle, and the distribution of personal items all become part of a narrative that is being assembled in reverse, starting from the final moment and moving backward through time. Among the first critical elements examined is Molly's phone, which becomes an immediate priority because it represents a timeline compressed into digital form, a record of movement, communication, and connection that can anchor the investigation in precise moments rather than speculation. And it is through this device that investigators begin to trace her final known interactions. including the crucial phone call that lasted approximately 22 minutes, a duration that now takes on significance far beyond its original context because it aligns with the estimated travel time between her home and the location where she was found, creating a temporal link that suggests coordination rather than coincidence. And this connection begins to shift investigative thinking toward the possibility that Molly was not simply traveling alone that night, but was instead following a sequence of instructions or expectations tied to that call. As the phone data is analyzed further, additional patterns begin to emerge, including location information and communication history that place James Addy at the center of Molly's final movements, not as a distant figure but as the last sustained contact before her death. And this realization begins to reshape the structure of the case, because it introduces the possibility that the emotional relationship between them may have intersected directly with the circumstances of her murder, and that what appeared externally as a romantic relationship may have contained within it a far more dangerous undercurrent of manipulation and control. Meanwhile, at the scene itself, investigators recover additional physical evidence, including personal items that do not appear randomly displaced but instead suggest a moment of transition, as if Molly had arrived at the location expecting something brief, something controlled, something that did not require preparation for danger, and this absence of defensive disruption becomes a key observation, because it raises questions about whether she understood the situation she was entering or whether she had been guided into it under a different expectation entirely. The presence of her vehicle adds another layer to the reconstruction because it indicates that she arrived under her own mobility, yet the positioning and final state of the scene suggest that whatever occurred happened after arrival, not before, and this distinction is critical because it narrows the timeline of events to a confined window in which interaction must have taken place between her and at least one other individual, and that interaction becomes the focal point of investigative urgency. As daylight strengthens, family members begin to arrive or be contacted, and the emotional dimension of the case becomes unavoidable because the investigation is no longer just about reconstructing events, but about confronting the sudden collapse of a future that had been actively planned. And for those closest to Molly, the news does not arrive as information alone, but as disorientation, a fracture in reality that forces immediate reevaluation of everything they believed to be stable only hours before. At the same time, detectives begin the process of mapping Molly's relationships, identifying who she knew, who she trusted, and who had access to her in the critical hours before her death. And in this mapping exercise, one name quickly becomes central, not because it is immediately confirmed as suspect, but because it sits at the intersection of multiple lines of inquiry, emotional, logistical, and temporal. And that name is James Addy. The significance of James emerges not from a single piece of evidence, but from convergence, because he is not only the last known phone contact, but also someone deeply embedded in Molly's life as a fiancé, someone who had access to her routines, her plans, and her expectations for the future. And in homicide investigations, proximity combined with timing is never dismissed lightly. It becomes a focal point for deeper scrutiny. As investigators begin to consider this connection, they also become aware of the broader complexity surrounding James's personal life, including his long-term marriage, a fact that had not been immediately visible during initial notifications. And this revelation adds a new dimension to the case, because it introduces the possibility that Molly's understanding of her relationship may have been incomplete in ways that could have bearing on motive, deception, or conflict. With this information, the investigation begins to expand beyond the crime scene itself into the lives of those involved, examining not only physical evidence but emotional and relational dynamics, because in cases where intimacy and violence intersect, understanding the relationship becomes as important as understanding the act itself. And so detectives begin to reconstruct the timeline not just of the night of the murder, but of the months and years leading up to it, tracing patterns of contact, behavior, and inconsistency that might explain how Molly Watson ended up alone on a rural road with her life ending in a single, decisive moment. By the time the sun fully rises over Monroe County, the scene has been processed, evidence has been collected, and the body has been removed. But what remains is a growing realization among investigators that this case is not going to be solved through a single clue or isolated discovery, because the circumstances surrounding Molly's death are embedded in a much larger structure of hidden relationships and divided lives. And somewhere within that structure lies the answer to why a woman who was supposed to be celebrating her future was instead found at its abrupt and violent end. As the investigation into Molly Watson's murder begins to widen beyond the isolated stretch of rural road where her body was found, detectives quickly realize that the most difficult part of the case is not identifying what happened in the final moment, but understanding the network of relationships and contradictions that led her there, because on paper Molly's life appears stable, even hopeful. A young mother engaged to be married, surrounded by family, working toward a future that seemed increasingly defined and imminent. But beneath that surface stability lies a more complex emotional structure shaped by her relationship with James Addy, a man who now sits at the center of every emerging line of inquiry, not because he is immediately proven guilty, but because he occupies the most critical intersection of access, timing, and emotional proximity. When detectives begin their formal interviews and background checks, they initially approach James as the grieving fiancé, the person who would logically be devastated by the loss of someone he was preparing to marry, but that expectation begins to fracture almost immediately as inconsistencies emerge in how his personal life is presented versus what records and witnesses begin to reveal. Because James is not only engaged to Molly Watson, he is also a long-term husband to another woman, Melanie Addy, a fact that had not been disclosed during the initial emergency response, and this revelation fundamentally changes the direction of the investigation, transforming what was first treated as a straightforward homicide into a case involving deception, parallel relationships, and potentially motive rooted in emotional entanglement and control. The discovery of his existing marriage introduces immediate complexity because it raises questions about how long these overlapping relationships had existed, whether Molly was aware of the full extent of James's marital status, and whether there were moments of conflict or pressure that might connect emotional instability to the events of the night she was killed. And investigators begin to reconstruct a dual timeline, one anchored in James's life with Melanie, and another in his relationship with Molly, and as these timelines are laid side by side, the gaps between them become increasingly difficult to ignore. In interviews with those who knew James through his marriage, a pattern begins to form that describes a man who valued control within the household, someone who preferred structured dynamics where authority was clear and unchallenged, and while these accounts do not directly implicate him in violence, they begin to build a psychological profile that investigators cannot overlook, especially when combined with emerging evidence from Molly's social circle that suggests she was deeply emotionally invested in the relationship, to the point of planning a wedding that many around her believed represented a final step into a stable future. As detectives dig deeper into Molly's final days, they focus heavily on communication records, because in modern investigations, digital interactions often provide the most reliable reconstruction of intent and movement, and what they find is a concentrated pattern of contact between Molly and James in the hours leading up to her death, including the critical 22-minute phone call that now stands as the most significant temporal marker in the case, because it aligns precisely with the estimated travel time between her home and the remote location where she was ultimately found. And this alignment immediately raises the possibility that her movements that night were not self-directed in isolation but influenced or coordinated through that communication. The content of the call itself cannot be fully recovered in detail, but its timing and duration becomes central to investigative theory because it suggests sustained conversation rather than a brief exchange. And in cases where victims are lured or guided to isolated locations, prolonged phone contact often indicates either reassurance, instruction, or emotional manipulation. And detectives begin to consider whether Molly believed she was going to meet James under circumstances that felt private, personal, or related to their relationship, rather than something dangerous or final. As this theory begins to form, investigators also examine Molly's movements earlier in the evening, noting that she left her family home abruptly after receiving a phone call, without providing detailed explanation to her parents, a detail that in isolation might seem ordinary, but in context becomes highly significant because it suggests urgency. And urgency in homicide timelines often correlates with external prompting, especially when the victim is otherwise known to be stable and routine-oriented in their behavior. At the same time, attention turns to James's movements during the same period, and here investigators encounter a narrative that begins to show inconsistencies, particularly in his account of leaving home to visit a friend and returning later, claims that are difficult to independently verify and that become more scrutinized as additional evidence accumulates, because in homicide investigations, alibis that rely on uncorroborated social visits are often considered weak unless supported by independent confirmation. The situation becomes even more complex when forensic analysis of Molly's phone reveals not only the call history, but also search activity in the days leading up to her death, including searches related to James's other relationship and his marital status, suggesting that at some point she may have begun to suspect inconsistencies in the story she had been told. And this possibility introduces a new dimension to the investigation, because it raises the question of whether the relationship was entering a phase of confrontation or realization, a moment when hidden truths begin to surface and emotional stability becomes threatened. While investigators are careful not to draw conclusions prematurely, they cannot ignore the psychological significance of this development, because in many cases involving intimate partners or close emotional relationships, escalation often occurs when secrecy is at risk of exposure. And Molly's increasing awareness of inconsistencies could have placed pressure on James that he may have perceived as escalating or destabilizing. As the investigation expands, detectives also begin interviewing individuals connected to both Molly and James, including co-workers from the correctional facility where they met, and these interviews provide additional insight into their dynamic, particularly the emotional imbalance that appeared to characterize their relationship, with Molly described as deeply invested and hopeful, while James is often described as reserved, detached, and inconsistent in his emotional engagement. And this contrast becomes increasingly important as investigators attempt to understand whether the relationship was mutually perceived in the same way by both parties, or whether there was a fundamental asymmetry in expectation and intent. Meanwhile, physical evidence from the crime scene continues to be analyzed, including personal items and trace materials that begin to suggest that Molly did not appear to have been in a prolonged struggle, a detail that reinforces the theory that she may have been taken by surprise or placed in a situation where she did not anticipate immediate danger. And this absence of defensive indicators becomes a key point in understanding the nature of the encounter that occurred at the low water crossing. As days pass, the investigation begins to narrow its focus more directly on James Addy, not because alternative suspects are entirely excluded, but because every new layer of evidence seems to converge around his presence in Molly's final hours, and in investigative terms this convergence is significant, because it reduces the likelihood of coincidence and increases the probability of direct involvement, especially when combined with motive theories that now include emotional pressure, potential exposure of his double life, and the collapse of control over relationships that had been maintained in parallel for years. However, despite this growing focus, investigators remain cautious because at this stage evidence is still largely circumstantial in nature, built from timelines, communications, and behavioral patterns rather than direct forensic linkage to the act itself, and they understand that in order to move from suspicion to prosecution, they will need more than correlation. They will need physical or testimonial evidence that directly connects James Addy to the moment of Molly Watson's death. And so the investigation enters a critical phase, one defined by the search for that bridge between narrative and proof, between what appears to have happened and what can be legally established, a phase in which every detail of the night of April 27th is dissected repeatedly, every phone record re-examined, every witness statement compared against timing and geography, as detectives attempt to reconstruct not only how Molly Watson ended up on that remote road, but who was with her when her final moment arrived, and why that moment unfolded in a way that left no chance for return. As the investigation into Molly Watson's murder deepens, the case begins to shift from a broad exploration of relationships and timelines into a tightly focused search for a single moment where suspicion transforms into certainty, because detectives understand that while motive and opportunity can build a compelling narrative, they are not enough on their own to secure a conviction, and what they need now is the breakthrough point, the piece of evidence or testimony that collapses the remaining distance between theory and proof, and in cases built on emotional entanglement and deception, that breakthrough often comes not from a dramatic discovery, but from the slow alignment of inconsistencies that begin to reinforce one another until they form a pattern too precise to ignore. In James Addy's case, that pattern begins to sharpen as investigators continue to reconstruct the final hours of Molly Watson's life, focusing intensely on the 22-minute phone call that now functions as the spine of the timeline, because it connects her last known movements directly to the remote location where she was found, and when combined with her abrupt departure from home shortly after receiving that call, it creates a sequence that suggests direction rather than coincidence. A guided progression toward a specific destination that no longer appears random in hindsight. As digital forensics expand, additional layers of communication begin to surface, including patterns that suggest sustained contact between Molly and James in the days leading up to the murder, and while none of these interactions are inherently incriminating in isolation, their concentration and timing begin to form a behavioral arc that investigators interpret as increasing urgency, as if something in the relationship had reached a critical threshold that required resolution. At the same time, forensic examination of Molly's phone and search history introduces a development that significantly alters the psychological interpretation of the case, because evidence indicates she had been searching for information related to James's personal life and, more specifically, the status of his relationship with his wife, Melanie Addy. And while the exact timing of her awareness cannot be fully reconstructed, the presence of these searches suggests that she may have been moving toward a realization that the narrative she had been given was incomplete, and in investigative psychology, moments of realization like this are often considered destabilizing points in intimate partner cases because they introduce the possibility of confrontation, exposure, or emotional rupture that can escalate tension rapidly. Parallel to this digital evidence, investigators begin to strengthen their understanding of James's movements on the night of April 27th by cross-referencing his statements with available phone records, witness accounts, and geographic feasibility, and what emerges is a timeline that contains both structure and ambiguity. Structure in the sense that certain events are clearly anchored, such as his departure from home and his claimed return, but ambiguity in the gaps between those anchors, where independent verification becomes difficult, and where the possibility of unaccounted movement remains open, and in homicide investigations those gaps are never neutral, they become focal points of suspicion until they can be conclusively explained. One of the most significant aspects of the investigation during this phase is the gradual shift in how James Addy is perceived within the evidentiary framework of the case, because he is no longer viewed solely as a grieving fiancé or a distant husband with an unrelated marriage, but as an individual whose presence intersects with every critical point in Molly's final hours and in investigative reasoning. Repeated intersection is rarely dismissed as coincidence, especially when those intersections align with opportunity and proximity to the crime scene. Detectives also begin to explore the emotional dynamics of the relationship more deeply, conducting interviews with individuals who observed Molly and James together over time, and what emerges from these accounts is a consistent description of imbalance, where Molly appears emotionally invested, forward-looking, and increasingly committed to a shared future, while James is described as more detached, less expressive, and at times disengaged during discussions of the wedding, a contrast that becomes particularly significant in retrospect because it suggests differing levels of emotional alignment regarding the same future event. As investigators analyze this disparity, they begin to consider the possibility that the relationship may have been asymmetrical not only in emotional intensity, but in intention, meaning that while Molly may have believed she was moving toward a finalized commitment, James may have been navigating a different internal reality shaped by constraint, avoidance, or conflicting obligations. And when such asymmetry exists in relationships that are approaching major life events like marriage, it can create psychological pressure points that often precede crisis. During this same period, forensic analysis of Molly's personal communications reveals indications that she may have been experiencing uncertainty in the days leading up to her death, not necessarily full awareness of danger, but moments of doubt and questioning that suggest she was beginning to reassess aspects of her relationship, particularly in relation to James's explanations about his personal life. And while these signs are subtle, They are important because they indicate a shift from passive trust to active inquiry, a transition that often marks the beginning of emotional destabilization in cases involving deception. Meanwhile, investigators continue to examine physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, including trace materials and the positioning of items near Molly's body, and what becomes increasingly clear is the absence of indicators consistent with a prolonged struggle, suggesting instead a brief and decisive encounter, one that likely occurred under circumstances where Molly did not anticipate immediate lethal threat. And this observation reinforces the theory that she may have arrived at the location believing she was meeting someone she knew, rather than entering a situation of imminent danger. As these strands of evidence begin to converge, attention returns repeatedly to the phone call that initiated her final movements, because it remains the only direct communication link between Molly's last known period of activity and the location where she was found, and investigators begin to explore theories of manipulation, considering whether the call may have functioned not merely as conversation but as a mechanism of guidance, reassurance, or emotional framing that led her to comply with directions that placed her in isolation. At this stage of the investigation, the case reaches its critical turning point because multiple independent lines of inquiry are now pointing toward a single central figure, James Addy, not through a single definitive piece of evidence, but through the accumulation of converging circumstances, emotional proximity, temporal alignment, behavioral inconsistency, and relational complexity. And while each of these elements alone could potentially be explained within alternative frameworks, together they create a structure that is increasingly difficult to separate from the hypothesis of direct involvement. Investigators also begin to consider the broader psychological context of control within James's personal relationships, drawing from accounts of his marriage to Melanie Addy, where patterns of dominance, restriction, and resistance to autonomy have been described, and while these accounts do not directly prove criminal intent, they contribute to a developing profile in which control appears to be a recurring theme across different aspects of his interpersonal behavior, both within marriage and in extramarital involvement. As pressure on the investigation increases, detectives intensify their focus on corroborating James's whereabouts during the critical window of time, seeking independent verification that can either confirm or eliminate his presence near the location of the murder, because they understand that establishing physical proximity to the crime scene during the narrow time frame of death would represent the decisive breakthrough needed to move the case from circumstantial accumulation to prosecutorial strength. And so the investigation enters its most decisive phase, one defined by the narrowing of possibilities, the tightening of timelines, and the relentless pursuit of a moment where the constructed separation between suspicion and certainty finally collapses. A moment that will determine not only the legal outcome of the case, but the final interpretation of how a young woman preparing for her wedding ended up alone on a rural road with no opportunity to return, and how the man who stood at the center of her future came to stand at the center of her death. By the time the case of Molly Watson reaches the courtroom in the spring of 2021, what had once been a fragmented investigation built on scattered timelines, emotional testimonies, and digital traces has now been transformed into a structured narrative of accusation, one that no longer depends on isolated pieces of evidence, but on the cumulative weight of convergence. Because prosecutors understand that the strength of this case does not lie in a single dramatic moment, but in the way every path of inquiry repeatedly circles back to the same central figure, James Addy, and in the controlled silence of the courtroom, that convergence becomes the foundation upon which the entire argument is constructed. The prosecution begins by reconstructing the final hours of April 27th, carefully laying out the sequence of events that led Molly Watson from her home to the remote low-water crossing where she was ultimately found, emphasizing the 22-minute phone call that functions as the temporal spine of the case, because it connects her last known conscious decision-making directly to the location of her death. And in the courtroom, this detail takes on a new kind of weight, no longer just an investigative observation, but a narrative bridge between life and violence. Jurors are shown how Molly left her home shortly after that call, how she drove alone into rural isolation, and how her final destination aligns precisely with the duration of that communication, creating what prosecutors describe as a guided progression rather than a random journey, a sequence that suggests not only presence but influence, and as this timeline is repeated, reinforced, and visually mapped, it becomes increasingly difficult for the courtroom audience to separate coincidence from coordination. The prosecution then turns to the nature of the relationship between Molly Watson and James Addy, presenting it not as a simple romantic engagement, but as a deeply imbalanced emotional structure defined by secrecy, parallel commitments, and sustained deception, because James was not only engaged to Molly, he was also maintaining a long-term marriage with Melanie Addy. And this dual existence becomes central to the motive narrative, because it establishes a pressure point that exists independently of the murder itself, a situation in which exposure, confrontation, or collapse of secrecy could have significant personal consequences. In building this argument, prosecutors carefully walk the jury through evidence of communication patterns, emotional investment, and behavioral inconsistencies, showing how Molly's increasing commitment to marriage coincided with growing instability in James's ability to maintain separation between his two lives, and how this convergence of timelines created a situation where control over information and perception became increasingly difficult to sustain. The courtroom presentation also introduces forensic evidence recovered from the crime scene, including the positioning of Molly's body and the lack of indicators consistent with prolonged struggle, reinforcing the theory that she was not engaged in a defensive confrontation but rather placed into a situation that escalated rapidly and decisively. And this absence of struggle is framed not as absence of violence, but as evidence of control, suggesting a scenario in which the victim did not anticipate the final outcome of the encounter. One of the most significant moments in the prosecution's case comes with the introduction of the discarded T-shirt found near the scene, which forensic analysis reveals contained both gunshot residue and traces of Molly Watson's blood, and this item becomes a focal point not only because of its physical significance, but because of its origin, as testimony establishes that the shirt was connected to James Addy's household, specifically linked to his daughter, creating a direct material bridge between the crime scene and his domestic environment, a connection that transforms abstract suspicion into tangible linkage. The defense attempts to challenge the interpretation of this evidence by questioning chain of custody and alternative explanations for its presence, but the prosecution reinforces its argument by layering this forensic detail within the broader context of timeline alignment, communication records, and behavioral testimony, creating a cumulative narrative that does not rely on any single point but on the interdependence of all points reinforcing each other. Perhaps one of the most emotionally impactful moments of the trial comes from the testimony of James Addy's daughter, Emma, whose account places her father at home later than he initially claimed, directly contradicting his stated alibi, and in court this testimony carries a weight that extends beyond factual contradiction, because it represents the internal fracture of a family structure now forced into public exposure, where loyalty and truth collide under legal obligation, and Emma's description of her father's behavior that night, including his immediate shower and the use of bleach, is presented by the prosecution as behavior consistent with an attempt to eliminate traces of a prior event. As this testimony unfolds, the courtroom atmosphere shifts noticeably, because it introduces not only contradiction but intimacy, the idea that the truth of the timeline is being verified from within the defendant's own household, and this internal confirmation strengthens the prosecution's argument that James Addy's version of events cannot be fully reconciled with independent observation. The defense, in turn, attempts to reframe the case as circumstantial, emphasizing the absence of direct eyewitness testimony to the act itself, and arguing that emotional complexity, marital issues, and relational entanglement do not equate to criminal responsibility, but even as these arguments are presented, they struggle to dismantle the structural coherence of the prosecution's timeline, which continues to present a tightly aligned sequence from phone call to travel to discovery. Throughout the trial, the image of Molly Watson as presented to the jury remains central to the emotional dimension of the case, not as a legal strategy of sentimentality, but as a reminder of what was lost in temporal proximity to the alleged act, a young woman actively preparing for marriage, engaged in future planning, and emotionally invested in a life that was abruptly terminated at the threshold of transition, and this proximity between anticipation and death becomes one of the most powerful contextual elements in the courtroom narrative. As closing arguments approach, prosecutors return repeatedly to the concept of control, not only physical control over a victim in a remote location, but emotional and psychological control exercised through communication, deception, and the manipulation of relational expectations, arguing that the convergence of James Addy's dual life created a situation in which maintaining separation was no longer sustainable, and that the night of April 27th represented the collapse of that structure under pressure. The defense maintains that suspicion is not proof, and that the absence of direct forensic evidence placing James Addy at the exact moment of the shooting must create reasonable doubt. But by this stage of the trial, the jury has been exposed to a layered reconstruction of events that connects nearly every critical element of the case back to the defendant through time, relationship, and physical evidence. When deliberation concludes, the verdict is delivered with a clarity that reflects the prosecution's central argument, and James Addy is found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Molly Watson, a conclusion that transforms years of investigation into a single moment of judicial resolution. And in that moment, the courtroom shifts from a space of argument to one of finality, where competing narratives are replaced by legal certainty. The sentencing follows, with life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a decision that reflects both the severity of the crime and the structural certainty built through the trial process. And as the sentence is read, the emotional weight of the case settles not only on the defendant, but on the families who have lived through years of uncertainty, testimony, and reconstruction. Yet, even as the legal system reaches its conclusion, the deeper complexity of the case remains in the minds of those who followed it, because what was revealed in court was not only a murder, but a pattern of overlapping lives, emotional asymmetry, and hidden structures of deception that allowed two realities to exist side by side until they collided in irreversible consequence. And in that collision, Molly Watson's life ended at the precise moment she believed she was stepping into its next chapter, leaving behind a question that no verdict can fully answer about how trust can be shaped, maintained, and ultimately broken in ways that no one recognizes until it is already too late. In the aftermath of the trial, when the courtroom empties and the formal language of law gives way to the quieter, more enduring language of absence, what remains in the case of Molly Watson is not only a concluded investigation, but a lingering emotional landscape shaped by everything that led to and followed her death. Because legal resolution does not dissolve grief, it only gives it a boundary within which it must now exist. And for her family, that boundary is both a relief and a burden. A place where certainty has been achieved but wholeness cannot be restored. The verdict against James Addy brings closure in a procedural sense, but it does not return the ordinary continuity of life that was interrupted on a rural Missouri road. And for those who loved Molly, the world is permanently divided into before and after, with the after defined not by her presence, but by the absence that continues to shape every moment that follows. In the small, quiet rituals of remembrance, her family continues to carry her forward in ways that attempt to preserve her identity beyond the circumstances of her death, because to reduce her life to its final moment would be to lose everything she was before it: a daughter, a mother, a woman who built her life around care, connection, and the belief that people could grow into something better than their past. Her son grows up with her memory shaped by stories rather than lived experience, assembling an image of her through photographs, conversations, and the emotional echoes of those who knew her best. And in that reconstruction there is both love and incompleteness, because memory can preserve presence but not replace it, and every milestone that passes without her becomes a reminder of the future that was taken away. For Molly's family, the act of visiting her gravesite becomes a continuation of relationship rather than an ending, a place where conversation replaces silence, where grief becomes dialogue, and where the weight of unanswered questions is softened but never fully removed, because even with justice served, the question of why she was chosen for such a violent end remains something that cannot be fully contained within legal reasoning. As time passes, the case itself becomes part of a broader reflection on how hidden structures of deception can exist within ordinary environments, how a person can maintain parallel lives over years without detection by those closest to them, and how emotional trust can become the very mechanism through which vulnerability is created. And in the case of James Addy, The existence of a long-term marriage alongside a committed relationship with Molly Watson becomes not just a detail of motive, but a symbol of the fragmentation that defined the entire tragedy. Within Melanie Addy's life, the aftermath unfolds in a different but equally transformative way because the revelation of her husband's double life forces a complete reconstruction of her understanding of the past, where memories that once felt stable now require reinterpretation, and moments that once seemed ordinary are re-examined through the lens of what was hidden beneath them, including unexplained absences, emotional distance, and behavioral changes that only now acquire meaning in retrospect. Her eventual separation from that life is not portrayed as dramatic release, but as gradual disentanglement, a process of rebuilding identity outside the framework of a marriage that no longer corresponds to the truth of what it contained. And in that rebuilding there is both loss and survival, because even as she steps away from the structure that defined her for years, she also steps into a reality where autonomy and clarity replace confusion and constraint. The broader community, too, is left to reconcile the fact that the image of normalcy within a small rural setting can coexist with hidden complexity that remains invisible until it is violently revealed. And in that realization, there is a quiet disruption of trust, not only in individuals, but in the assumption that familiarity guarantees understanding. Because the case demonstrates that proximity does not always equal knowledge, and that even within environments where everyone is known, the most significant truths can remain unseen for years. For those who followed the investigation, the case becomes a study in how emotional dependency, secrecy, and control can intersect in ways that escalate beyond perception until the moment of irreversible consequence. And while the legal system identifies responsibility in the form of a conviction, it cannot fully address the underlying human dynamics that allowed the situation to develop. Because those dynamics exist in the spaces between communication, in the unspoken expectations of relationships, and in the gradual erosion of boundaries that once seemed secure. Molly Watson's story, when viewed in its entirety, is not only about the night she was killed, but about the years in which she built a vision of the future that felt increasingly real, a future that included partnership, stability, and continuity, and the devastating interruption of that future becomes the central emotional truth that remains after all evidence has been presented and all arguments have concluded. In remembering her, those closest to her resist the reduction of her identity to the circumstances of her death, emphasizing instead the qualities that defined her life, her devotion as a mother, her warmth in relationships, her determination to build something meaningful despite the pressures she faced. And in that remembrance, there is an attempt to restore balance to a narrative that was violently unbalanced in its final moment. Ultimately, the case leaves behind a dual legacy, one of justice achieved through legal process and one of irreversible loss that no verdict can repair, and between those two realities lies the enduring human weight of the story, the recognition that behind every investigation are lives that continue to unfold in the absence of someone who should still be present, and that the most lasting impact of such a crime is not only in how it is solved, but in how it reshapes the lives of those who must continue forward while carrying the memory of what was taken from them. When the story of Molly Watson is finally told in full, what remains most unsettling is not only the brutality of the act that ended her life, but the ordinary texture of everything that surrounded it, because nothing in the days, weeks, or even years leading up to that final night appeared, from the outside, to belong to the language of tragedy. And yet tragedy often grows in precisely those spaces where life feels most familiar, most stable, most believable, until the moment it no longer is. In retrospect, every element of her world becomes part of a larger pattern that only makes sense after it has already collapsed. The long phone calls that seemed like intimacy, the sudden urgency that felt like love, the plans for a wedding that represented certainty, and the emotional investment that built a future so vivid it felt already real, all of it reframed by what came afterward. Not because those moments were inherently suspicious on their own, but because they were part of a structure that was being shaped in parallel by someone living a completely separate truth. James Addy's double life stands at the center of that structure, not as a single explanation but as a framework through which contradiction was maintained for years, a framework that depended on separation, silence, and the assumption that emotional worlds would not collide, and for a long time that assumption held, allowing two narratives to exist side by side without fully interacting until the night they did. What makes this case linger long after the verdict is not uncertainty about legal outcome, but the way it reveals how easily perception can be shaped when information is divided, when intimacy is distributed across contexts that do not communicate with each other, and when trust becomes the mechanism through which contradiction is temporarily suspended rather than resolved. Molly believed in a future that was actively being built in front of her, not because she was naive in a simple sense, but because the emotional evidence she was receiving reinforced that belief at every stage, and in relationships structured around partial truth, belief is not a failure of intelligence. It is a response to consistency within a limited frame of reference, and that frame can remain intact even when it excludes essential information that exists elsewhere in the same reality. On the other side of that same reality, Melanie Addy was living within a different set of assumptions, ones that were also disrupted only later, not through gradual awareness but through sudden collision with facts that redefined her entire understanding of the life she had been part of. And in that collision, there is a different kind of tragedy. One rooted not in physical violence, but in the retroactive reconstruction of meaning, where years of shared life must be reinterpreted through the lens of what was hidden. The investigation itself becomes, in hindsight, an example of how modern cases are often solved not by a single decisive breakthrough but by accumulation, by the slow alignment of digital traces, behavioral inconsistencies, testimonial contradictions, and forensic fragments that, when placed together, form a structure that becomes increasingly difficult to interpret in any way other than convergence toward a single point of responsibility. The 22-minute phone call, the abrupt departure from home, the remote location of the crime scene, the absence of prolonged struggle, the inconsistencies in alibi statements, the contradictions revealed through family testimony, and the evidence of parallel relationships all function not as isolated facts, but as interconnected points on a timeline that steadily narrows as it approaches its final conclusion, until what once appeared fragmented resolves into a sequence that investigators and ultimately jurors could follow with increasing clarity. Yet even as that clarity is achieved within the legal system, the emotional reality remains far more complex, because justice, while definitive in its structure, does not operate in the same way as human understanding, and it cannot fully account for the internal worlds that existed before the crime, the beliefs that shaped decisions, or the emotional pathways that allowed two parallel lives to be maintained until they could no longer remain separate. In reflecting on Molly Watson's life, what emerges most strongly is not the manner of her death, but the intensity with which she lived toward her future, the commitment she made to building stability, family, and purpose, and the way that commitment was interrupted at the exact moment it was closest to fulfillment, creating a contrast that defines the emotional core of the case. Because it transforms her story from one of simple victimhood into one of interrupted continuity, a life not only ended but redirected into absence at the point of arrival. For those who remain, the aftermath is not a single moment of closure, but a continuous process of adjustment, where memory becomes the primary form of relationship, and where grief does not diminish so much as it changes shape over time, becoming less acute in its immediate pain but more persistent in its presence, integrated into daily life rather than separate from it. The case also leaves behind a broader reflection on how deception can operate within emotionally intimate spaces without immediate detection, not necessarily because people are careless, but because emotional relationships are built on trust that assumes coherence between words and reality, and when that coherence is carefully managed through separation and selective disclosure, it can sustain itself far longer than external observers might expect. In the end, the story of Molly Watson is not only about what happened on a rural Missouri road, but about the invisible architecture of relationships that can exist behind ordinary appearances and the devastating consequences that occur when those architectures collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, leaving behind not just legal answers, but enduring questions about how well we can ever truly know the lives that exist closest to us.